So the message today is about wake up. And it also seems to be about shining because we have quite a bit of that lyrics in the song. But wake up, shine. So most of you probably know about my online ministry, Deborah's Tree. And a lot of times people ask me about the name and they don't know what it refers to, which they're often quite surprised when they find out that it's about a biblical story about Deborah, the judge and prophet, because many people haven't heard about Deborah or her tree. So I thought I'd tell some of her story today in case you've never heard of her or in case you need a reminder about her contribution to the biblical story, which, as we know from Swedenborgian theology, is really the story about us. So today I'm focusing just on one specific part of her story, and it's the part about wake up, Deborah, wake up and sing a song. But before that, in case you're not familiar, I'm going to read a bit of the background to the story of Deborah and Barak and the wake up bit. And we heard some of that in the readings, but I'm going to be reading now from Judges 4 and then one verse from Judges 5. The Israelites again did evil in the Lord's sight after Ehud's death. The Lord turned them over to King Jabin of Canaan, who ruled in Hazor. The general of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. The Israelites cried out for help to the Lord because Sisera had 900 chariots with iron-rimmed wheels, and he cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. Now Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She would sit under the date palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the Ephraimite country. The Israelites would come up to her to have their disputes settled. She summoned Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh in Naphtali. She said to him, "Is it not true that the Lord God of Israel is commanding you? Go, march to Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun. I will bring Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to you at the Kishon River, along with his chariots and huge army. I will hand him over to you." Then I'm omitting the part about Deborah and Barak and 10,000 soldiers going up to Mount Tabor. Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. The Lord routed Sisera, all his chariotry, and all his army with the edge of the sword, and the land had rest for 40 years. So a disclaimer before I talk any further is that stories about massive battles and people being slaughtered and murder, rape, and violence are not my favorite stories in the Word. And all of those elements are actually in this story in Judges 4 and 5. So on the surface, this would not be a story that I'm attracted to. But I understand from a Swedenborgian perspective that they are a necessary part of telling the deeper story of our spiritual journeys and the spiritual struggles that are part of it. I still don't relish reading and hearing them and really speaking about them, but I'm setting aside my distaste in order to lift up a message about waking up, which is in the story. So this story took place about 1100 BCE. It's told in Judges 4 and 5. And it's one of many where the leader of Israel, this time it was Deborah the prophetess, were called on to engage in warfare. And often this story is ignored, the story of Deborah. Even though she was a very successful prophet, she was a victorious leader in war, and she kept peace for 40 years, which doesn't happen very often in the story of the Israelites. Deborah is one of 5 prophetesses in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Gospels, and those women are Miriam, Huldah, Isaiah's wife, and Anna. Though other women like Sarah and Mary spoke prophetic words in specific circumstances, but they weren't considered prophetesses. Those other prophetesses delivered messages of gratitude and celebration, of imminent judgment, of promises of restoration and hope before and after Deborah. But she was the only prophetess that was called on to lead in war. And as we've heard in those readings, the Israelites had been under attack for 20 years and they were debilitated. The army was depleted, commerce and travel were dangerous. It was not wise to go too far from your home. But the Divine One was still speaking to the Israelites through the judge and prophet Deborah. She would sit under her tree and interpret the religious law for them when they had misunderstandings. So maybe a little bit of explanation about what judges did, what it meant to be a judge. It wasn't really about deciding on matters of secular law, because basically all of the law was religious law. The judge had to have an understanding of the extensive religious laws in the 5 books of the Torah, so that they could ensure that the Mosaic covenant was being properly followed. I don't know, nobody really knows if Deborah could read, which would be unusual for a woman, and sort of memorized the Torah that way, or whether she had just learnt it from the oral tradition. But one way or another, she was an expert in the Mosaic covenant. So interpreting the covenantal laws was really as much a part of the Jewish practice for the Israelites as the animal sacrifices and ritual purity and so forth that the priests were following in where the tabernacle was in Shiloh. But back to the judges, there were local judges throughout Israel who were responsible, and they would have all been men, I'm imagining at this point, and they were responsible for interpreting the law in their towns and local regions. But Deborah was the high judge, the one to whom people were sent if the local judge was unable to render a verdict. So that's what it meant when it said she was leading Israel. It also meant, like Joshua and many of the other judges, that she was responsible for leading Israel in war when Jehovah gave the command to attack or to defend. Now, Deborah was also a prophetess, and I'm not really sure exactly how they defined that. I think it would be somebody who, either a woman or a person, that would go into some kind of trance or have some convincing way to be able to say that the divine has spoken to me and is giving you a message. But they were obviously very respected. So her role as a prophet is not prominent in the Bible as much as her role as the judge and the military leader. I'm assuming that she'd been functioning as a prophet before the story of this battle begins, because she's identified straight up at the beginning as a prophetess. But we don't know any specifics about how the divine had spoken through her up to that point. In fact, there's only 3 prophetic moments described in this story of Deborah in the Bible. One is her apparently receiving a divine command to summon Barak to lead the army. And then the second one was her telling Barak it's time to spring into action, because the divine has said this is the day that General Sisera would be handed over to him. And the third one is her prophecy which we didn't read today, but she made a prophecy that a woman would kill General Sisera, which was what happened. It wasn't her, it was somebody else. So wake up, Deborah. She apparently got a wake-up call from the divine while she was doing her judge and prophetess duties. She was called to be, I love this phrase, a motherly protector in Israel, which indicates to me that it was time to protect the people from their enemies. First, she commanded her general Barak to assemble the troops and take them to Mount Tabor. Then, when she woke up to the next divine command, she told Barak, now is the time, spring into action. She knew it was the right time for the divine to lead them to victory. A little backstory: when she'd originally summoned Barak and told him to take on King Jabin's army, he'd said, if you go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I will not go. He didn't want the responsibility of leading the army by himself. He wanted to know that the divine was leading through the prophetess. He needed to hear that command, spring into action, when it was actually time. He was willing to fight, but he also needed a wake-up call. Spring into action, Barak. So, from a Swedenborgian sort of lens, looking more deeply at the personal message in the story and in the need to wake up and spring into action, first of all, I turned to Swedenborg. And there's not a lot about this story in Swedenborg's writings, but here's what I found. In general, as you might expect, the story of Deborah and Barak is about the battles of spiritual struggle. Maybe not so obvious is that it's also about the perversion of truth and the renewal of truth, which indicates to me the specific kind of spiritual struggle that this particular battle corresponds to. It's more focused on the quality of the principles that are guiding our lives than on how we live out these principles. It's a kind of a struggle in discerning the quality of how we're leading our lives, the principles. Another way in Swedenborg that the meaning is expressed about this story is that it's about the revival of spiritual religion. What is spiritual religion? In Swedenborgian theology, it's religious practice that responds to hearing the word, that discerns divine truths about how to live and love other people. It's not religious practice that focuses on following religious laws, which was very much what the Hebrew religion was at that time. It's also not about religious practices that respond to a loving relationship with the Divine One, which ultimately the kingdom of heaven was the message that Jesus gave for the Christian church. So if I'm kind of bring the threads together of what Swedenborg wrote, I could say that this story of Deborah represents a spiritual battle that is all about the quality of the principles by which we are living our lives, with hopefully the end result that we start to live, or maybe go back to living, by principles that are grounded in the Word, grounded in divine truth as we understand it. So maybe a little deeper, specifically, Swedenborg also writes that deliverance from Jabin's lengthy oppression means deliverance from being blocked from heaven flowing into us. Deliverance from being blocked from having heaven flow into us. So the spiritual story, the inner story that I see developing here is that we might need to go through a period of time when we're being blocked from heavenly inflow that would otherwise help us to discern the divine truths that should be guiding our lives. Maybe we're going through a time of depression, or we're obsessing over a distressing relationship, or we're struggling with an addiction, or we're questioning the existence of the divine. Any of those things and many, many more could be blocking us from inflow from heaven. We are being tormented figuratively by King Jabin and his metal-rimmed chariots while we're going through that. But eventually we are brought back through our spiritual struggles to the truer principles that have guided our lives before, or that we are looking for. We can feel the relief of returning to a divine truth-based spirituality instead of living by being tormented by twisted ideas and feelings that have been running our lives previously. So that's the overall picture of what this battle and victory are about in our spiritual journeys. It might be ringing true for you, or it might not have been part of your spiritual path thus far, but either way, the story involves a time of waking up. The story involves a spiritual moment that we have all either had or will have. Wake up is about waking up from spiritual sleep to receiving spiritual life. So just going back to that Apocalypse Explained number, that I'm not going to read the whole thing because this whole sermon will take way too long, but people who are awake mean people who are spiritually awake, that is, those who receive spiritual life from the divine. So sort of the takeaway meaning I'm getting is that this story is more deeply about feeling blocked from heavenly influence, perhaps because of difficult life circumstances, perhaps remaining in the dark because of false concepts that are not helping in clearly seeing the divine and feeling heavenly influence. And it's about struggling to get clarity and heavenly influence back, and then feeling spiritually revived and renewed when our false thinking is replaced by thoughts that are closer to the truth. But first of all, the Divine One's call to us in this process is to wake up, spring into action. We need to wake up, spring into action, and sing a song of praise to get this process going. When we're spiritually asleep, we may not even know that we are being blocked by our fallacious or even self-serving ideas. So at some point, we'll be called to wake up and to develop enough self-awareness to realize that we're feeling spiritually blocked. And after that, of course, comes the spiritual struggle with those false ideas that are getting in the way of the inflow of heaven. And the divine is fighting with us and for us. But of course, we have to bring our own consciousness to the spiritual struggle as well. So I'm going to skip over a little bit here because I realize that we are running a little bit over time maybe for the sermon portion. But I'm just going to conclude by saying, like Deborah's general, we might feel blocked or be hesitant or feel unsure of our mental or emotional or spiritual readiness for the battles that spiritual change requires. We might want to be rest assured of divine presence and strength like Barak did. But like Deborah and Barak, we need to listen for the divine voice saying, wake up. Now is the time. Spring into action. Now is the time for you to wake up and work with me on that thing that you know that you need to change in your life. So when the time is right, the divine will wake us up from spiritual darkness and lead us into a bright new life, into new personal and spiritual territory. Scary as that may be after what seems like 20 years of spiritual oppression. But the promise is still there, and the invitation is still there. Wake up, sing a song, spring into action.